The morning the Guineas came was a Tuesday in early May of 2003. I remember the heat was already wrong for that time of year. A thick, damp heat that promised a bad season for pests. The air was the color of weak tea and smelled of dust and pollen. I was 71 then, and I'd been on that same piece of ground for 50 of those years, and you learn to read a season in its first few weeks. This one was going to be a trial. The delivery truck, a repurposed bread van with rattling cages stacked inside, kicked up a plume of brown dust as it groaned up the lane. 90 of them, 90 pearl gray Guinea Keats, barely 2 days old, making a sound like 1,000 tiny, frantic crickets. They cost me $450, plus shipping. A price that felt both trivial and enormous at the same time. I'd set up the brooder in the old milk house, a circle of cardboard 16 feet across with 2 heat lamps pouring a drowsy, red light onto fresh pine shavings. The driver, a young man with a pierced eyebrow and no interest in my purchase beyond the signature on his clipboard, helped me transfer them. 90 fluff balls of nervous energy, a chaotic sea of spots and stripes that scurried from our hands as if we were death itself. When the van was gone, the silence it left behind was heavier than the noise had been. All I could hear was the frantic, high-pitched peeping from the milk house and the low hum of the heat lamps. I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle, and I had the profound and unsettling feeling that I had just made a very public fool of myself. My neighbor, Will, confirmed it for me before the day was out. He drove a 3-year-old Dodge Ram that never had a speck of mud on it, not even on the tires. He was a good neighbor in the practical sense. He'd help you pull a calf or lend you a post driver without a second thought. But he was a man who believed in new equipment and certified seed. He believed in data. He pulled up to the fence line where I was checking the tension on the wire for the South 40, the pasture that was the whole reason for the 90 peeping birds in my milk house. He rolled down his passenger window with a soft electronic whir. "Heard you got a delivery," he said. He didn't smile, but his eyes were amused. In a town this small, news travels faster than a stomach bug. The man at the co-op who sold me the starter feed had likely made the first call. By noon, the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown. I was apparently starting a rare bird sanctuary. I just nodded. 90 of them. Will leaned his arm on the open window frame. "What are you doing with 90 guineas on 40 acres of standing water?" The South 40 wasn't standing water, not really, but it was low ground, heavy clay, and it held the damp. The far edge of it was a dense treeline of oak and hickory that was shady and cool and, for the last 5 years, had become a paradise for ticks. A breeding ground like I'd never seen. "I'm farming," I told him, which was the plain truth. He shook his head, a slow, pitying motion. "The extension agent was just out at my place last week. Said this is going to be the worst tick season on record. He's got a new spray regimen, a dual-action pyrethroid mix. Said it'll give you 95% knockdown with 2 applications." I knew the agent. A decent young man with a degree from the state university and a binder full of charts. He wore brand-new Carhartts that were still stiff. He meant well. "He said the co-op is getting a tow-behind sprayer you can rent," Will continued. $850 a day. Or you can buy a new one for about $1,200. That's the way to handle it. Hit him hard and hit him fast. He was trying to be helpful. I knew that. He was offering me the modern, sensible solution. The one with data and percentages. He looked from my face toward the milk house, where the frantic peeping was a faint, unsettling hum on the air. "Those things," he said, and now he did smile just a little. "They're just coyote food that makes a lot of noise." I didn't say anything. I just gave the high-tensile wire another twist with my pliers. He waited for me to argue, to defend myself. When I didn't, he just sighed. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you." The window whirred shut and the clean truck rolled away. I stood there, listening to the wire sing. Coyote food that makes a lot of noise. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. But I hadn't spent the $450 on a whim. I was betting on something else. I was betting on a memory, and on a line of spidery handwriting in a book that hadn't been opened in 30 years. I didn't know yet what the Guineas knew, but I had a suspicion they knew more than the man with the binder full of charts. The ground was remembering a problem, and I was trying to remember the solution. For the next week, I lived with the sound. The peeping of the Keats was constant, a shrill, ever-present backdrop to my days. It was the first thing I heard in the morning and the last thing I heard at night. My wife, Martha, who had the patience of a stone but the hearing of a bat, took to closing the kitchen window that faced the milk house. She hadn't said much when I told her what I was doing. She'd been married to me long enough to know there were two kinds of foolishness I was prone to, the expensive kind and the sentimental kind. This, she figured, was a cheap combination of both. "How many acres are we talking about?" she'd asked, her one and only question on the matter. "The South 40, I'd said. She just nodded, doing the math in her head. 40 acres. A $1,200 sprayer versus $450 of noisy birds. She was a practical woman. She was willing to let the experiment run its course. But the doubt was a quiet guest at our supper table. And it wasn't just her. I felt it myself, a low thrum of anxiety every time I went into the milk house to check their feed and water. The little birds were fragile. A sudden chill, a draft, a bit of fouled water, and you could lose half of them overnight. I felt the weight of Will's certainty, of the extension agent's data. The sensible, modern world was telling me I was a sentimental old man playing with birdseed while a real problem festered in my pasture. I'll own that I came close to quitting. On a Thursday morning, after finding 2 of the Keats had been trampled in the night, I walked from the milk house straight to the phone in the kitchen. My hand was on the receiver. I had the number for the equipment rental place in town written on the calendar that hung by the wall. It would be so easy. A phone call, a trip to town, and $150 for the day. I could have that pasture soaked in pyrethroids by lunchtime. I could be done with it. I could have silence. My hand rested on the cool plastic of the phone, and I thought about the silence. But then I thought about my grandfather. His name was Thomas, and he'd been dead for 30 years. He was a hard, quiet man who had farmed the same land through the Depression and 2 wars. He had hands like worn leather straps, and he seldom spoke more than was necessary. But when he did speak, it was usually to correct a mistake I was about to make. He had a saying for almost everything. "A problem that walks," he told me once, "is better than a problem you have to buy in a can." I must have been 10 or 11. We were standing by this very same South 40. The cattle were grazing peacefully, and walking among them, almost under their feet, was a flock of his own guineas. They moved with a strange, purposeful strut, their heads bobbing, their necks long and skinny. They looked like little gray vultures, prehistoric and alert. He called them his gray patrol. He never had a tick problem. Not a serious one. His cattle were clean, their hides sleek. He never sprayed his pastures. He never owned a sprayer. He trusted the birds. He said they paid attention. That was one of his highest compliments. He'd say it about a good dog, or a hired man who saw what needed doing without being told. "He pays attention," he said it about the guineas. He claimed they'd work a field in a grid, a moving fence of appetite that missed nothing. I remember watching them, fascinated. They weren't like the chickens, who scratched and dawdled. The guineas marched. They moved with an unnerving, collective intelligence. One would find a grasshopper, let out a sharp, chattering cry, and the whole flock would converge on the spot, a flurry of gray feathers and stabbing beaks, and then, just as quickly, they would reform their line and continue their slow, methodical sweep. I pulled my hand back from the phone. The image of my grandfather was clearer in my mind than the rental sprayer. His quiet confidence. His trust in a living system over a chemical one. He believed the land offered its own solutions, if you were patient enough to see them. He believed the ground remembers what you forget. I had forgotten about the gray patrol. The ticks had become a modern problem, and I had been looking for a modern answer. But the problem wasn't new. It was old. As old as deer and cattle and the shade of an oak tree on a hot day. I turned away from the phone and went back out to the milk house. The peeping of the 90 Keats no longer sounded like a problem. It sounded like a promise. It sounded like the beginning of an answer my grandfather had handed down to me, an answer I'd almost been too proud or too modern to accept. That evening, after chores, I went to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the barn office. It had been my grandfather's. The wood was dark oak, scarred and stained from 100 years of farm life. The roll-top was stiff, and it complained with a loud groan as I pushed it up, releasing a smell of dry paper, old ink, and faint, lingering pipe tobacco. He hadn't smoked a pipe in the last 20 years of his life, but the smell was baked into the wood, a ghost of his presence. The desk was a mess of forgotten things. Invoices from the 50s. Parts catalogs for tractors that had long since been turned to scrap. Dried-up ink bottles. A scattering of rusty paper clips. I was looking for one specific thing, his farm ledgers. He kept one every year, a meticulous record of his world. I found them on the bottom shelf, a stack of 20 or so marbled composition books, their corners soft and rounded with use. I pulled out the ones from the late 1950s, the time I remembered watching his gray patrol in the South 40. I took the one marked 1958 and carried it over to the workbench under the single fly-specked bulb that lit the space. I sat on a stool, the book open in my lap. The pages were filled with his handwriting, a spidery but surprisingly neat cursive. The pencil now faded to a soft brown. It was a portrait of a year, told in numbers and brief, declarative sentences. January 3rd, 4 inches snow. Temp 12F. Mended harness. February 19th. Sold 2 steers, 8 cents per pound. Paid down note at bank. March 28th. Plowed the north field. Broke a shear pin on the Oliver. I turned the pages slowly, feeling the dry, brittle paper under my thumb. Felt like an act of archaeology, digging through the layers of my own past. I found entries about calving, about haying, about the price of gasoline being 26 cents a gallon. Then, in early June, I found what I was looking for. June 5th. Let the Keats out of the coop. 42 of them. The entry was simple, but it was the one below it that made me stop. It was a note, almost an afterthought, circled in the same brown pencil. It read, "Gray Patrol pays its own way." He'd used that phrase with me. It was his highest financial praise. It meant an asset that cost nothing to maintain, or even turned a small profit. It was the farm equivalent of a miracle. But there was more. Below that, another line with a small question mark penciled after it. Check the South 40 trillion. Muck. And then the final, underlined sentence, a declaration of faith. Never needed chemicals. I read the lines 3 times. He knew. He knew the trillion on the South 40 was the problem area. He'd even questioned if it was the damp soil, the muck, that held them there. He had seen the same problem I was seeing now, almost 50 years later. And he had solved it. Not with a sprayer, not with a can of poison, but with a walking, chattering flock of 42 birds. He had left me a map. A cryptic, half-forgotten map, but a map nonetheless. A wave of something warm and solid moved through me. It was the feeling of a conversation picked up after a long silence. The doubt that had been sitting on my shoulder for a week evaporated under the dim light of that barn bulb. I wasn't a sentimental fool. I was following a proven method. I closed the ledger and put it carefully back on the shelf. The next morning I was out before 5, mixing the starter feed for the Keats. Their peeping sounded different now. It sounded like business. The work of raising them took on a new purpose. For the next 5 weeks, they were my first chore and my last. I expanded their cardboard ring as they grew, giving them more space. I watched them transition from soft, downy fluff to the awkward, pin-feathered stage of adolescence. They were ugly birds, there's no denying it. Their heads were bald and bluish, with strange wattles and knobs. They looked like something a committee designed in the dark. But they were hardy. I lost only 3 more after that first week, which for 90 birds was a good rate. They grew fast, their chirps deepening into a strange, 2-note call that sounded like it was saying buckwheat by the 3rd week of June. They were nearly full-sized, feathered out in their pearl gray coats, speckled with 1,000 tiny white dots. They were ready. The South 40 was waiting. The day I let them out was hotter than the day they'd arrived. The sun was a white disk in a hazy sky. The air was thick enough to drink. I'd spent the morning setting up a small, temporary coop near the gate to the south pasture, A simple A-frame with a roost, so they'd have a place to come home to. The plan was to let them out for a few hours in the afternoon and herd them back in before dusk, until they learned the routine. I'll admit I was nervous. These weren't chickens, content to stay within sight of the coop. Guineas have a wild streak. There was a good chance they'd take one look at the open space and just keep going, a gift to the hawks and coyotes Will had warned me about. I opened the door to their transport crate. For a moment, nothing happened. They huddled in the back, a mass of gray feathers and suspicious, beady eyes. Then one, braver than the rest, hopped down onto the grass. Stood there, head cocked, taking in the world. Then another followed, and another, until all 85 of them were clustered in a nervous group at my feet. They made low, clucking sounds, a murmur of uncertainty. Then the brave one took a few stiff-legged steps into the pasture, its long neck extended. It stabbed its beak at the ground, came up with something, and swallowed. It let out a sharp, ratcheting cry, and the spell was broken. The flock began to move, and they didn't just wander. They marched, just as I remembered from my grandfather's time. They fell into a loose formation, a ragged front line about 30 feet wide, and began to sweep forward into the tall grass. Their heads were down, their eyes scanning, their beaks striking the ground with a steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tapping. They were a living machine, a self-propelled engine of pest control. A living fence. I watched them for an hour, a slow smile spreading across my face. They were doing exactly what he'd said they would. That afternoon, I started my own methodical work. I went to the workshop and built what's called a tick drag. It's a simple tool, a 4-foot wooden dowel with a 5-foot square of white flannel cloth attached to it. The idea is you drag the cloth over the grass and brush, and the ticks, waiting for a host to brush by, latch onto the fabric. It makes the invisible visible. I walked out to the far fence of the South 40, 100 yards from the shady treeline my grandfather had noted in his ledger. I held the dowel and began to walk a straight line toward the trees, dragging the white cloth behind me. The grass was high and thick, still damp near the soil despite the heat. When I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped and lifted the cloth. My stomach turned. The white flannel was crawling with them. Dozens of them. Tiny, dark specks of seed ticks, reddish-brown nymphs the size of a pinhead, and a few fat, gray adults already swelling with a blood meal they hadn't even had yet. I took the cloth to a patch of bare dirt and started counting. I used the tip of a pocket knife to flick each one into a jar of soapy water. The final count for that first 100-yard drag, 32. 32 ticks. I wrote the number down in a small notebook I'd brought for this purpose. Date, time, location, count. The extension agent's binder had nothing on the sick feeling of seeing that number made real on a piece of white cloth. I did 3 more drags that day at different points along the pasture, and the numbers were all in the same range. 28, 35, 29. The South 40 was sicker than I'd even realized. The cattle knew it. That's why they'd been spending all their time bunched up in the one high, dry corner of the pasture, stamping and switching their tails, miserable in the heat. They knew where the danger was. As the sun started to dip, the guineas began their own slow march back toward the coop, their crops bulging. They went in without any protest, as if they knew this was home. The experiment had begun. The baseline was set. Now all I had to do was wait and watch and trust the gray patrol. The weeks of high summer passed slowly, measured in the height of the corn and the declining number of ticks in my notebook. Every Tuesday morning, I'd go out with my white flannel drag and walk the same 4 transects in the South 40. I kept the records meticulously, just as my grandfather had kept his ledgers. It was a ritual. The first week after the guineas started foraging, the count on that first drag dropped from 32 to 24. A noticeable dip, but not yet proof. Will drove by while I was out there, his truck slowing as he passed. He didn't stop, just gave me a look that said he was still waiting for the punchline. The second week, the count was 18. The third week, it was 11. The numbers were falling steadily, consistently. Pattern was emerging. The guineas had established their routine. They'd emerge from the coop shortly after dawn, spend an hour or so near the gate, And then, as the day warmed, they would begin their inexorable march toward the far end of the pasture, toward the treeline. They spent the hottest part of the day, from late morning until late afternoon, working that shady, damp edge of the woods. They knew. I don't know how they knew, but they did. They knew the ticks didn't like the hot, open sun. They knew the ticks waited in the cool shade of the oaks and hickories, in the leaf litter and the tall grass along the edge of the forest. They were concentrating their efforts exactly where the problem was most concentrated. They were doing what my grandfather's note had told me to do. They were checking the South 40 treeline. They were smarter than any chemical. A chemical just blankets everything, the good and the bad. A chemical doesn't know where to focus. The birds knew. They were a targeted solution, guided by an instinct honed over thousands of years. I started mapping their movements, sketching the pasture in my notebook and shading the areas where they spent the most time. Their daily map and my tick count map were nearly identical. The correlation was perfect. The cattle noticed before I did, really. By the fourth week, I came out one afternoon to find them spread out across the entire pasture. A few were even grazing peacefully in the shade of the treeline, a place they hadn't ventured into for years. They were calm. The constant, agitated tail switching had stopped. Their coats looked better. They were putting on weight instead of wasting energy fighting off parasites. It was a quiet, profound change. One evening, Martha walked out to the porch where I was sitting, cleaning my tick drag cloth. She stood there for a moment, her arms crossed, looking out over the fields. The air was filled with the strange, rhythmic buckwheat call of the Guineas as they settled in for the night. For weeks, she'd called it a racket. "How are the tick birds?" she asked. It was the first time she'd brought it up since the day I bought them. I didn't say anything. I just handed her my little notebook, open to the page where I kept the weekly totals. She took it and studied the column of descending numbers. 32, 24, 18, 11, 7, 4. She traced the column with her finger, then looked up from the notebook, out toward the South 40 where the cattle were dark, calm shapes in the twilight. She handed the notebook back to me. "Your grandfather would have been pleased," she said. It was all the validation I needed. By the first week of August, the count on the first drag was 2. 2 small nymphs. The other 3 drags yielded 1, 0, and 1. The pasture was clean. The Guineas had done it. They had marched their way through the problem and consumed it. They had given me back my 40 acres. They were not coyote food. They were a living, breathing, working piece of farm equipment that fueled itself. And the noise they made no longer sounded like a racket. It sounded like victory. Summer began to fade. The nights grew a little cooler, the mornings touched with a hint of dew that wasn't just humidity. The goldenrod started to bloom along the fence lines, a sure sign that autumn was on its way. My last tick drag, in the second week of September, yielded a single tick across all 4 transects. 1. Down from an average of over 30. The war was over. But my grandfather's note had said the gray patrol pays its own way. The experiment wasn't complete until the books were balanced. It was time to cull the flock. I selected the 10 healthiest-looking birds, 2 males and 8 females, to keep as a breeding flock for the next year. They would be my insurance policy. The remaining 75 were the profit. I spent a morning rounding them up and loading them into poultry crates. They were heavy, solid birds, their breasts full and their bodies well-muscled from a summer of walking miles every day. They were nothing like a factory-raised broiler. I loaded the crates onto my old flatbed truck and drove an hour west, to a small, state-inspected processing facility run by a man named Elias. He was a third-generation butcher, a quiet man who specialized in poultry and rabbits for small-scale farmers and restaurants. His place was small but immaculate, the concrete floors spotless, the stainless steel gleaming. Elias didn't deal in volume. He dealt in quality. He came out to the truck as I was unstrapping the crates. He was a man in his 50s, with forearms like cured hams and a perpetually skeptical expression. He looked at the noisy Guineas crammed in the crates. 75 of them? He asked. His voice was flat. I nodded. He reached into a crate and grabbed one of the males. He was practiced, his movements quick and sure. The bird didn't even have time to squawk. He held it upside down by its legs, and then, with his other hand, he felt its breastbone, running his thumb along the keel. This was the moment of the quiet validating expert. He went silent. His skeptical expression softened into one of puzzlement. He turned the bird over, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He was expecting a scrawny, tough-range bird, all bone and sinew. These were different. He looked from the bird to me, and his eyes held a new respect. Substantial, he said. The word was low, but it landed with the force of a verdict. These are substantial birds. He set the first one down and picked up another, a hen this time. He did the same thing, feeling her weight, probing her breast. He shook his head slowly. What have you been feeding these things? They feel like they've been on finisher for a month. Mostly ticks, I told him. And grasshoppers. Whatever else they could find in the pasture. He gave me a sharp look, thinking I was joking. He saw I was serious. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. Well, I'll be, he said. Fat carries the flavor. Should be interesting. He told me he'd have them processed in 2 days and I could pick up the check the following week. When I returned, he had the numbers for me. The birds had dressed out at an average of 3.5 pounds each. A very good weight for a guinea. He'd found a ready market for them with a couple of high-end restaurants in the city, places that valued game birds with real flavor. He handed me the check. I looked at the number. After his processing fee, the total was $712. I did the math in my head as I drove home. The 90 keats had cost me $450. The starter feed for the first 6 weeks had been another $60. Total investment, $510. The check in my pocket was for $712. I had not only solved my tick problem for an entire season, I had turned a profit of $202. The $1,200 sprayer that Will had recommended, plus the cost of the chemicals, would have set me back almost $1,500 for the year. And I would have had to do it again the next year, and the year after that. The Guineas, on the other hand, had paid me for the privilege of cleaning my field. My grandfather was right. The Gray Patrol pays its own way. I had a healthy, calm herd of cattle. I had a clean pasture. I had a small, thriving flock of guineas ready for the next season. And I had $200 extra in my pocket. I had traded a modern, expensive, recurring problem for an ancient, profitable, self-sustaining solution. A few weeks later, on a crisp October afternoon, I was walking that same fence line on the South 40, checking for any wires the cattle might have loosened. The leaves on the oaks and hickories were turning, a blaze of rust and gold against a sharp blue sky. The air was clean and cool. It was my favorite time of year, a time of satisfaction, of work done and barns full. I saw Will's truck coming down the road, kicking up a little dust but still impossibly clean. He slowed and pulled over, stopping right where he had back in May. The window whirred down. He wasn't smiling this time. He was just looking. His gaze went past me, out over the South 40. He saw the cattle, all 50 of them, spread out like a picture in a magazine, grazing right up to the edge of the trees. They were fat and content. The pasture, which had been a source of worry for years, now looked like the healthiest piece of ground on my whole farm. The 10 remaining guineas were out there, too, making their slow, confident patrol through the stubble. Will watched them for a long time, his face unreadable. He didn't ask about the birds. He didn't ask about the ticks. He just made a simple observation, a statement of fact. Pasture looks better than it has in years, he said. I just nodded. It's good ground, he kept looking. His eyes narrowed in thought. He was a man who believed in data, and the data was right in front of him, chewing its cud. Then he said it, the quiet concession that was the only victory speech I needed. Haven't seen you running a sprayer over here this year. I leaned against a fence post and looked out at my field. I gave him the simple truth. Haven't had to. He held my gaze for a second, then gave a single, slow nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an admission of being wrong. It was just an acknowledgement. A small, grudging concession from a man of certainty to a man of patience. It was enough. He rolled up his window and drove away, leaving me there with the quiet field. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of the wind in the dry leaves and the occasional sharp cry of a guinea. I thought about my grandfather and his spidery handwriting in that old ledger. The ground remembers what you forget. He had known that the land holds both the problem and the answer. The cleverness of modern man is to believe we can impose a solution from the outside, with a tank and a nozzle and a chemical name too long to pronounce. The wisdom of an old farmer is to know that sometimes the solution is already there, walking on two legs, waiting for you to be quiet enough and patient enough to listen. The answer to my 21st century problem wasn't new. It was ancient. It was a partnership. A bargain struck between a farmer and a flock of strange, noisy birds. They would protect my cattle, and in return I would protect them from the coyotes and the hawks. We each had a job to do. It's a lesson I think we're in danger of forgetting. We look for answers in the catalog and on the internet. We trust the label on the can more than we trust the instincts of a living creature. But some problems don't need a clever fix. They just need attention. They need a long memory. They need a patrol. I still have that little notebook with the descending column of numbers. Sometimes I take it out and look at it. It's my own small ledger, a testament to a good summer's work. It reminds me that the best tools aren't always made of steel. Sometimes they're made of feathers and bone. And they come with a wisdom all their own. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, or an old piece of advice from your own grandfather that turned out to be true, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what the old ways have taught you. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There are more stories here if you have the patience for them.